A racist police officer assumes that a black man in the park is a criminal and arrests him for no reason. Afterwards, the officer realizes that he has just arrested an FBI agent. Jerome Hayes sat on a weathered bench in Riverside Park. The sun cast a warm glow over the lush greenery as he turned a page in the book he was reading, momentarily losing himself in the quiet rustle of leaves and the distant laughter of children playing. The park was one of his favorite places, a small sanctuary in a bustling city where he could clear his mind and escape the demands of his job. Today, though, his thoughts were interrupted. Across the park, Officer Garrett Knox patrolled the area, his sharp eyes scanning the surroundings. He had walked this beat for many years, and in his mind he knew this city better than anyone. When he noticed Jerome sitting alone on the bench, something in his gut stirred, a feeling he had learned to trust. A black man sitting alone, too calm, too composed. Suspicion prickled at the edges of his thoughts. "Never seen him around here before," Garrett muttered under his breath. He stopped walking and watched Jerome for a moment, trying to place the feeling. There had been reports of a suspect fitting a general description that matched Jerome. A vague, flimsy lead, but it was enough for Garrett. Jerome felt the weight of someone's gaze and looked up from his book. He noticed Garrett standing a distance away, staring at him with a look that was all too familiar. Jerome had been in situations like this before. He could read the officer's expression easily, prejudice masquerading as concern, a suspicion that had no basis other than the color of his skin. But Jerome did not flinch. Instead, he closed his book slowly, marking the page with a finger, and met Garrett's gaze. Garrett's grip on his baton tightened. He saw the way Jerome looked at him, steady and unafraid. It unnerved him. "Let's see what this guy is up to," Garrett muttered as he started walking toward Jerome. His posture stiffened with each step. He did not like how Jerome was looking at him, did not like the calmness, the lack of fear. It was unsettling. Jerome watched Garrett approach, keeping his expression neutral. He knew what was coming and had seen it many times before. The situation was already loaded, and he knew that how he responded in the next moments could determine how it played out. He was not in the mood for this today, but he also was not going to give the officer any reason to escalate the situation. "Afternoon," Garrett said as he reached the bench. His tone was polite, but there was an edge to it. Jerome could hear the underlying suspicion. "Afternoon," Jerome replied, his voice calm and even. He kept his hands visible, resting them on the closed book in his lap. "What brings you out here today?" Garrett asked. His eyes scanned Jerome's face, then flicked to the book. He was fishing for something, anything to justify the feeling gnawing at him. "Just enjoying the park," Jerome said. "It is a nice day." Garrett nodded slowly, though he was not really listening. He was more interested in what Jerome was not saying, in what he could dig out from beneath the surface. "You from around here?" Jerome smiled slightly, though it did not reach his eyes. "I have been around." The non-answer did not sit well with Garrett. He shifted his weight, his stance becoming more confrontational. "Mind if I see some ID?" Jerome's smile faded. This was the point where things could go sideways. He knew his rights, knew he was not obligated to show ID just for sitting in a public park, but he also knew that refusing could escalate the situation quickly. Still, he was not going to let this officer intimidate him. "Am I under arrest?" Jerome asked, his tone measured. He met Garrett's gaze without flinching. Garrett bristled at the question. There was that calmness again, that refusal to be intimidated. It made him uneasy, made him feel like he was losing control of the situation. "You will be if you do not cooperate," Garrett shot back. His hand moved to rest on his holster. Jerome took a slow breath, keeping his expression neutral. He did not like where this was heading, but he was not going to back down. "I'm just sitting in a park," he said, his voice steady. "Is there a law against that?" Garrett's patience was wearing thin. "You fit the description of someone we are looking for," he said, though even he knew how weak the excuse sounded. He stepped closer, looming over Jerome. Jerome did not move. He held Garrett's gaze, refusing to give him the reaction he was looking for. "And what description is that?" Jerome asked quietly. Garrett's jaw tightened. He did not have a good answer, and he knew it. But admitting that would mean losing face, losing control. He was not about to let that happen. "Do not get smart with me," he snapped. "Show me some ID now." For a moment, the two men locked eyes, the tension thickening between them. Jerome knew he could push back, could assert his rights. But he also knew that doing so could make this situation even more dangerous. He decided to comply for now. Without a word, he reached into his pocket slowly, deliberately, and pulled out his wallet. Garrett watched every movement closely, his body coiled like a spring. When Jerome handed over his ID, Garrett snatched it out of his hand and glanced at it. The name did not mean anything to him, but that did not matter. He had already made up his mind. "Stand up," Garrett ordered, stepping back to give Jerome room. Jerome sighed inwardly, but did as he was told, rising slowly from the bench. He kept his hands visible, not wanting to give Garrett any reason to claim he felt threatened. "Turn around," Garrett said, pulling out a pair of handcuffs. Jerome felt a surge of frustration but pushed it down. He turned around, letting Garrett cuff him without resistance. He could hear people nearby, could feel their eyes on him, but he stayed calm, knowing that the worst thing he could do now was give in to anger. As Garrett tightened the cuffs around Jerome's wrists, he could not shake the feeling that something was off, that he was making a mistake, but his pride would not let him stop now. He grabbed Jerome's arm and started leading him toward the patrol car parked nearby. Jerome did not say a word as they walked, his mind already shifted to what would come next. He was not worried about himself. He knew who he was, knew that this officer would find out soon enough, but he could not help but feel a deep weariness. A tiredness that went beyond this one encounter. It was the exhaustion of knowing that despite all his accomplishments, all his efforts, he was still seen as just another black man in the eyes of too many people like Officer Garrett Knox. As they reached the patrol car, Garrett opened the back door and guided Jerome inside. The tension still hung in the air. Jerome settled into the seat, the cold metal of the handcuffs biting into his wrists. He looked out the window as the car pulled away from the park, watching the trees blur past, wondering how this day, like so many others, had gone so wrong. The patrol car's engine hummed as Officer Garrett Knox drove Jerome Hayes toward the precinct. Garrett's grip on the steering wheel was tight, his knuckles white as he processed what had just happened. He did not like the way Jerome had looked at him back there in the park, calm and unafraid, like he knew something Garrett did not. It gnawed at him, made him question his instincts, but his pride would not let him admit that. Jerome sat quietly in the back seat, his hands cuffed behind him. The city streets blurred by, but his mind was not on the passing scenery. Instead, he focused on what would happen next. He knew the system, knew how quickly things could escalate if he was not careful, but he also knew his own power, the authority that came with his position, an authority that Officer Knox had no idea about. As they neared the precinct, Garrett glanced at Jerome in the rearview mirror. "What were you really doing in that park?" he asked, his voice edged with suspicion. Jerome met Garrett's eyes in the mirror, his expression unreadable. "I told you," he replied calmly. "I was just reading." Garrett scoffed. "A guy like you just sitting around reading? You expect me to believe that?" Jerome raised an eyebrow. "A guy like me?" he repeated, his tone measured. Garrett hesitated for a moment, realizing the slip in his words, but instead of backing down, he doubled down. "You do not look like someone who spends his afternoons reading in the park," he said, trying to justify his actions. Jerome did not respond immediately. He let the silence stretch, the tension in the car thickening. When he finally spoke, his voice was cool and controlled. "And what does someone like me look like, officer?" Garrett did not answer. He could not. He knew what he was implying, knew how it sounded, but he was not about to admit that to Jerome or to himself. Instead, he focused on driving, his frustration mounting as Jerome's calm demeanor continued to unsettle him. The car pulled into the precinct's parking lot and Garrett parked near the entrance. He got out first, then opened the back door and helped Jerome out. The cuffs still dug into Jerome's wrists as they walked toward the building. Garrett's thoughts raced. He needed to figure out what to do next. This was not how arrests were supposed to go. The suspect was supposed to be scared, compliant, not composed, and challenging him with every word. Inside the precinct, the usual buzz of activity filled the air. Officers filing reports, phones ringing, the hum of conversation. Garrett led Jerome through the main hall, ignoring the curious glances from other officers. He did not want to explain himself just yet, not until he was sure of his next move. They reached the booking area and Garrett signaled for Jerome to stand by the processing desk. The officer behind the desk, a young man named Officer Jenkins, looked up, surprised to see Garrett bringing someone in. "What is this about?" Jenkins asked, his eyes flicking to Jerome, then back to Garrett. "Caught him acting suspicious in the park," Garrett replied, his tone clipped. He handed over Jerome's ID, still unwilling to admit that he did not have a solid reason for the arrest. Jenkins glanced at the ID, then back at Jerome. There was a flicker of recognition in his eyes, but he quickly masked it, nodding as he began typing into the computer. Jerome noticed the brief hesitation, filing it away in his mind. The recognition was subtle, but it was there. "Captain Hale is in her office," Jenkins said as he handed the ID back to Garrett. "You will need to take him to her." Garrett stiffened slightly. Captain Vanessa Hale was known for being tough but fair, a stickler for procedure. He had not planned on involving her so soon, but he did not have a choice. "All right," Garrett said, his voice tight. He turned to Jerome, his grip firm on Jerome's arm. "Let us go." Jerome walked beside Garrett, his expression still unreadable, as they approached Captain Hale's office. He could sense the tension in Garrett, the uncertainty that the officer was trying so hard to hide. It was the first crack in the armor, and Jerome noted it with quiet satisfaction. Garrett knocked on the door, then opened it when he heard Captain Hale's voice from inside. The office was neat and organized, with a large desk in the center and shelves lined with books and files. Captain Vanessa Hale, a woman in her 40s with sharp eyes and a no-nonsense demeanor, looked up from her paperwork as they entered. "Officer Knox," she said, her tone neutral. "What is this about?" Garrett stepped forward, guiding Jerome into the room. "Caught this guy in the park, Captain. He was acting suspicious, would not cooperate when I asked for ID. Captain Hale's gaze shifted to Jerome, and for a split second there was a flicker of recognition, just like Jenkins. But she quickly masked it. Her expression turned professional. "Is that so?" she said, her voice even. Jerome met her eyes and saw the recognition there. He knew that Captain Hale was aware of who he was, but she was playing it carefully, waiting to see how Garrett would handle the situation. "That is right," Garrett continued, oblivious to the silent exchange between Jerome and Hale. "I brought him in for questioning." Captain Hale nodded slowly, her eyes narrowing slightly. "I see. And did you have probable cause to arrest him?" Garrett hesitated, feeling the ground beneath him start to shift. "He would not cooperate, Captain," he repeated, though it sounded weaker this time. Captain Hale leaned back in her chair, studying Garrett carefully. "Officer Knox, why do not you step outside for a moment? I would like to speak with Mr. Hayes alone." Garrett blinked, taken aback by the request, but Captain Hale said firmly, leaving no room for argument, "Officer Knox." Reluctantly, Garrett released Jerome and stepped out of the office, closing the door behind him. As soon as he was gone, Captain Hale's demeanor shifted slightly, becoming less formal. "Mr. Hayes," she said, her voice calm, "I apologize for this misunderstanding." Jerome allowed himself a small smile. "No need to apologize, Captain. You are just doing your job." Hale sighed, glancing at the closed door. "I am aware of who you are, but I would appreciate if we kept that under wraps for now. I need to handle this situation carefully." Jerome nodded. "Of course. I'm not here to cause trouble, Captain. I just want to make sure things are handled properly." "They will be," Hale assured him. "I will speak with Officer Knox and deal with this appropriately, but I have to ask, why did not you just tell him who you are?" Jerome's smile faded, replaced by a more serious expression. "Because it should not matter, Captain. My identity should not be the reason he decides to treat me with respect." Captain Hale considered his words, then nodded in understanding. "You are right. It should not matter, but unfortunately it does to some people." The room fell silent for a moment, the weight of the situation hanging in the air. Finally, Captain Hale stood up. "I will call Officer Knox back in. We will resolve this." Jerome nodded again, watching as Captain Hale moved to the door. The confrontation was not over, but he knew he had the upper hand now. The truth would come out soon enough, and Officer Knox would have to face the consequences of his actions. As Captain Hale opened the door, Garrett stepped back inside, his expression wary. He could sense that something had shifted, but he did not know what. He glanced at Jerome, who stood calmly waiting. "Mr. Hayes here is not the man you were looking for. You will release him immediately," Hale said. Garrett blinked, the words taking a moment to sink in. "What? But Captain—" Immediately, Officer Hale repeated, her voice leaving no room for argument. Garrett hesitated, then finally reached for the keys to unlock Jerome's handcuffs. His hand shook slightly as he did so, though the realization of his mistake beginning to dawn on him. As the cuffs clicked open, Jerome rubbed his wrists, giving Garrett a measured look. "Thank you, officer," he said, his tone calm but carrying an undertone of finality. Garrett swallowed hard, unsure of what to say. "You are free to go," he muttered, stepping back. Jerome nodded and turned to Captain Hale. "I will be in touch, Captain," he said quietly. "There is still a lot to discuss." Captain Hale nodded in return, understanding the weight behind his words. "I look forward to it, Mr. Hayes." With that, Jerome walked out of the office, leaving Garrett standing there, a sinking feeling in his gut. The confrontation was over, but the consequences were only beginning. Garrett Knox sat at his desk in the precinct. The tension in his body refused to dissipate. He had barely been able to concentrate since Captain Hale had released Jerome Hayes. The unease gnawed at him, deepened by the fact that he still did not understand what had just happened. He knew he had made a mistake, but the full extent of it was still out of reach. The silence of the precinct around him was both comforting and unnerving, a space for his thoughts to spiral. Suddenly, the sound of footsteps approaching his desk snapped him out of it. He looked up, to see Captain Hale walking toward him, her expression serious. Garrett's stomach tightened. He knew this was not going to be a casual conversation. "Officer Knox, my office now," Captain Hale said, her tone leaving no room for argument. Garrett stood up immediately, trying to suppress the nervousness that was beginning to creep into his demeanor. He followed her to the office, each step feeling heavier than the last. Once inside, Captain Hale closed the door behind him and gestured for him to sit. Garrett hesitated for a moment before sitting down. He could feel the tension in the room, the unspoken weight of what was coming. Captain Hale moved behind her desk, took a deep breath, and then sat down across from him, her sharp eyes fixed on his. "Officer Knox," she began, her tone measured but stern. "Do you have any idea who Jerome Hayes is?" Garrett shook his head, his confusion deepening. "No, Captain. Just some guy in the park." Captain Hale leaned forward, her gaze never leaving Garrett's. "Jerome Hayes is not just some guy in the park. He is a special agent, one of their top agents, in fact." The words hit Garrett like a physical blow. His eyes widened in shock, the implications of what he had done crashing down on him. "An FBI agent?" he repeated, his voice barely above a whisper. "That is right," Hale said, her voice firm. "And more than that, he is highly respected within the Bureau. His arrest is going to have serious consequences, not just for you, but for this entire precinct." Garrett's mind raced, trying to piece together what this meant. He had profiled and arrested an innocent man, a federal agent no less, based on nothing more than his own biased assumptions. The enormity of his mistake began to settle in, bringing with it a cold, creeping dread. "I did not know, Captain," Garrett said, his voice shaky. "I did not know who he was." "That is the problem, Knox," Hale replied, her tone still firm. "It should not have mattered who he was. Your actions were based on assumptions and prejudices, not on any real evidence. You cannot arrest someone just because they do not look like they belong in a park." Garrett wanted to argue, to defend himself, but the words would not come. Deep down, he knew Captain Hale was right. He had let his biases guide his actions, and now he was facing the consequences. "What happens now?" Garrett asked, his voice low, almost resigned. Captain Hale sighed, leaning back in her chair. "For now you are being placed on temporary leave while we investigate this incident. I have already spoken with the higher-ups, and they are not happy, to say the least. There will be an official review, and depending on the outcome, you could face disciplinary action up to and including termination." Garrett's heart sank. Termination. The word hung in the air like a death sentence. He had been a cop for years, and the thought of losing his career was almost too much to bear. But as much as he wanted to deny it, he knew he had no one to blame but himself. "I understand, Captain," Garrett finally said, his voice barely above a whisper. Hale studied him for a moment, her expression softening slightly. "I know this is not easy to hear, Knox, but you need to understand that your actions have consequences, not just for you, but for the people you serve. We cannot afford to have officers who let their biases dictate their decisions." Garrett nodded, though his mind was still reeling. The reality of his situation was starting to sink in, and with it came a flood of regret. He had always prided himself on being a good cop, someone who upheld the law and protected the community, but now all of that was in jeopardy because of one careless, prejudiced decision. Captain Hale stood up, signaling that the conversation was over. "You are dismissed, Officer Knox. I will notify you when the review is scheduled." Garrett stood up as well, feeling the weight of the world on his shoulders. "Thank you, Captain," he mumbled before turning and walking out of the office. As he left the precinct, the familiar sights and sounds that had once brought him comfort now felt distant, almost alien. He walked to his car, in a daze, the reality of his situation pressing down on him like a heavy fog. He had been a cop for so long that he did not know who he was without the badge. The thought of losing it, of being branded as a failure, terrified him. But beneath the fear there was something else, an unfamiliar sense of doubt. For the first time, Garrett was forced to confront the fact that maybe, just maybe, he was not the upstanding officer he had always believed himself to be. That maybe he had let his biases and prejudices guide his actions more than he was willing to admit. As he drove home, the city streets passing by in a blur, Garrett could not shake the image of Jerome Hayes' calm, unflinching gaze. It was a look that had unsettled him from the start, and now he understood why. Jerome had seen right through him, had known exactly what was happening even before Garrett himself did. When Garrett finally arrived home, he sat in his car for a long moment, staring at the steering wheel. The day's events played over and over in his mind, each repetition making the weight of his actions heavier. He did not know what the future held, but he knew that his life had just changed irrevocably. With a heavy sigh, Garrett got out of the car and walked into his house. The silence of the empty rooms pressed in on him. He sank into a chair, his thoughts a tangled mess of fear, regret, and uncertainty. For the first time in a long while, he did not know what to do next. Garrett Knox stood in the corridor outside the conference room, his heart pounding in his chest. The precinct was quieter than usual, the atmosphere heavy with the anticipation of what was about to unfold. The official review was about to begin, and Garrett knew that every word he said in the next hour could determine the future of his career. He glanced at his reflection in the window across from him. The man staring back looked older, more worn than he had just days ago. There was a stiffness in his posture, a tightness around his eyes that had not been there before. He straightened his uniform, took a deep breath, and forced himself to focus. This was his chance to explain, to justify his actions, though deep down he was not sure how to do that anymore. The door to the conference room opened, and Captain Hale appeared, her expression unreadable. "We are ready for you, Officer Knox," she said, her voice steady. Garrett nodded, swallowing hard as he followed her into the room. Inside, the atmosphere was tense. The long table was lined with stern-faced officials, representatives from the precinct's Internal Affairs Division, a couple of high-ranking officers, and at the far end a man in a suit whom Garrett instantly recognized as Jerome Hayes. Jerome's presence was like a punch to the gut. Garrett had hoped that he would not be there, that he would not have to face him again, but there he was, sitting calmly, his eyes focused on Garrett as if studying him. The look in those eyes was the same as before, calm and unflinching, but with an edge of quiet authority that made Garrett feel small. Captain Hale took her seat at the head of the table, motioning for Garrett to sit in the chair opposite. He did so, trying to ignore the way his palms were sweating. The room was silent, the weight of judgment heavy in the air. Officer Knox, Hale began, her tone formal. This review is to determine the appropriateness of your actions during the arrest of Mr. Jerome Hayes. We will go over the events leading up to the arrest, your conduct during the arrest, and the consequences that have followed. Do you understand the gravity of this situation? Yes, Captain, Garrett replied, his voice low but steady. He glanced briefly at Jerome, who was watching him intently, before returning his focus to Hale. Good, Hale said, nodding. Let us start with the incident report. According to your statement, you arrested Mr. Hayes because you believed he was a suspect in a recent series of robberies. Is that correct? Garrett nodded. Yes, Captain. I saw him in the park, and he matched the description we had. Tall black male. He was acting suspiciously, so I approached him. And what exactly was suspicious about his behavior? Hale asked, her tone neutral but probing. Garrett hesitated, knowing that his answer here was crucial. He was alone, just sitting there. And when I asked for his ID, he was evasive. Evasive how? Hale pressed. He did not want to show me his ID right away, Garrett explained, though even as he said the words, they sounded weak to his own ears. He seemed like he was hiding something. Jerome's voice cut through the air, calm but firm. I was reading a book, Officer Knox, not exactly the behavior of a criminal on the run. Garrett flinched slightly at Jerome's words, but kept his focus on Hale. I was just doing my job, Captain. I was trying to protect the community. And did you find anything on Mr. Hayes that would indicate he was involved in any criminal activity? Hale asked, her eyes narrowing slightly. Garrett shook his head. No, he was clean. There was a pause, a heavy silence that filled the room as everyone processed what had been said. Then one of the internal affairs officers spoke up, his voice stern. Officer Knox, did it ever occur to you that Mr. Hayes might have been telling the truth? That he was not the suspect you were looking for? Garrett hesitated again, his mind racing for the right words. I was following protocol. We are trained to be cautious, to assume that someone might be dangerous until proven otherwise. But did you consider that your assumptions might have been influenced by factors other than protocol? The officer asked pointedly. Garrett's throat tightened. He knew what they were getting at, and he knew there was no good answer. I did not mean to profile him, he said, his voice faltering slightly. I was just doing my job. Jerome leaned forward slightly, his gaze still fixed on Garrett. Your job is to protect and serve, Officer Knox, not to judge people based on their appearance. Garrett met Jerome's eyes, and for a moment he felt a surge of defensiveness, but it was quickly followed by a wave of guilt. He had been in law enforcement long enough to know when he was wrong, and this was one of those times. Captain Hale cleared her throat, drawing the room's attention back to her. Officer Knox, this review is not just about what happened that day. It is about the mindset that led to your actions. We need to ensure that every officer in this precinct is upholding the values of fairness and justice. This is not just about you. It is about the integrity of the entire police force. Garrett felt a sinking feeling in his gut. He knew that this was not just about whether or not he had made a mistake. It was about whether he was fit to continue wearing the badge. The realization hit him hard, and for a moment he struggled to find his voice. I understand, Captain, he finally said, his voice barely above a whisper. I did not mean to. I did not want to. He stopped, the words choking in his throat. Captain Hale softened slightly, though her tone remained firm. We all make mistakes, Knox, but it is how we deal with those mistakes that define us. You need to think very carefully about the kind of officer you want to be. There was another long pause, the weight of the situation pressing down on everyone in the room. Then Jerome spoke again, his voice calm but carrying a weight of authority. Captain Hale, may I say something? Hale nodded. Of course, Mr. Hayes. Jerome stood up, his presence commanding the attention of the room. He looked directly at Garrett, his expression serious but not unkind. I understand that being a police officer is a difficult job. You are under constant pressure, and sometimes that pressure can lead to bad decisions. But we cannot allow those bad decisions to go unchecked. This is not just about holding Officer Knox accountable. It is about ensuring that something like this does not happen again. Garrett listened, his heart heavy. He knew Jerome was right, but the truth of it was hard to swallow. He had spent his entire career believing he was doing the right thing, but now he was faced with the reality that his actions had caused harm, that his biases had blinded him to the truth. Jerome continued, his voice steady. I'm not here to ruin anyone's career, but I'm here to make sure that the next time an officer encounters someone like me, they think twice before making assumptions. This is an opportunity for change, and I hope that this precinct will take it seriously. Captain Hale nodded, her expression thoughtful. Thank you, Mr. Hayes. Your words are noted. Jerome sat down again, his gaze still on Garrett. There was no malice in his eyes, but there was a firmness, a resolve that made it clear he would not tolerate any further injustice. Captain Hale looked at Garrett, her tone softer but still authoritative. Officer Knox, you will remain on temporary leave while we continue this review. I suggest you take this time to reflect on what has been said here today. We will reconvene shortly to discuss the next step. Garrett nodded numbly, the weight of everything pressing down on him. Yes, Captain, he said quietly. The meeting was adjourned, and as the officials began to file out of the room, Garrett remained seated, his mind racing. He had come into this review hoping to defend himself, to justify his actions, but now all he could think about was how wrong he had been. The realization was like a cold, hard truth that he could not escape. As the last of the officials left the room, Garrett stood up slowly, his movements heavy with the burden of his thoughts. He glanced at Jerome one last time, and for a moment their eyes met. There was no animosity in Jerome's gaze, just a quiet determination, a resolve to see justice done. Garrett looked away, unable to hold Jerome's gaze any longer. He knew that he had a lot to think about, a lot to come to terms with, and as he walked out of the conference room, the weight of his actions and their consequences hung over him like a dark cloud. Captain Vanessa Hale sat in her office staring at the stack of reports on her desk. Each piece of paper represented a fragment of the truth she was trying to piece together. The internal investigation into Garrett Knox's conduct was underway, and it was her responsibility to ensure that every detail was thoroughly examined. She rubbed her temples, feeling the tension in her shoulders. The precinct had always prided itself on maintaining high standards, but this incident had shaken that foundation. Whatever the outcome, Hale knew that the investigation would have far-reaching consequences, not just for Garrett, but for the entire department. Taking a deep breath, she reached for the first report, the initial witness statements from the park. She had already read them multiple times, but each reread added weight to the growing evidence against Garrett. The witnesses, all park-goers present during the arrest, described the event with stark clarity. Their accounts were consistent. Garrett had approached Jerome Hayes with an assumption that he was a criminal, without hesitation and without attempting to de-escalate. Hale turned to the report on the body cam footage. She had watched it several times, each viewing more uncomfortable than the last. The footage was clear and unambiguous. Garrett's voice, his tone harsh, and his body language reflected the assumptions he had made from the moment he saw Jerome. The aggression in his approach, the way he had disregarded Jerome's attempts to explain, the force he used during the arrest. It was all there, laid bare for anyone to see. A knock at the door pulled Hale from her thoughts. She looked up to see Detective Harper, her second-in-command for the investigation, standing in the doorway. "I have got the last of the witness interviews," Harper said, holding up a file, "and I have scheduled Jerome Hayes for later this afternoon." "Thanks, Harper," Hale replied, taking the file. "How is it looking?" Harper sighed, running a hand through his graying hair. "Not good, Captain. Most of the witnesses are pretty clear about what they saw, and from what I can tell, the body cam footage backs them up." Hale nodded grimly. "I was afraid of that. Are we bringing Garrett in for another round of questions?" "Yeah," Hale said, leaning back in her chair. "Let us see if he is ready to talk more openly about what happened." Harper nodded and left the office, leaving Hale alone with the file. She flipped it open and began reading the new witness statements. They were consistent with the others. Garrett had acted aggressively from the start, and it was clear that Jerome had been trying to defuse the situation, but Garrett had not listened. As Hale finished writing, she felt a deep sense of unease. She had known Garrett for years. He had always been a solid officer, but this incident had exposed a side of him that Hale had never seen before. The hours passed slowly as Hale continued to review the evidence. Finally, there was another knock at her door and Harper entered, followed by Garrett. "Come in, Knox," Hale said, keeping her voice neutral. Garrett looked exhausted, his eyes dark with sleeplessness. He sat down across from Hale, glancing nervously at Harper, who took a seat beside him. "We are going to go over the events of that day again," Hale said, leaning forward slightly. "I need you to be completely honest with us, Garrett. This is your chance to explain your side of the story." Garrett nodded, but his expression was tight. "I understand, Captain." Hale glanced at Harper, who started the questioning. "Garrett, walk us through what was going through your mind when you first saw Jerome Hayes in the park." Garrett hesitated, his eyes shifting as he searched for the right words. "I saw a man who fit the description of the suspect we were looking for. It was a high-pressure situation, and I had to make a quick decision." "And what made you so sure he was the suspect?" Harper pressed. "He matched the description," Garrett repeated, his voice more defensive now. "We were looking for a black male around his height and build. He was acting suspiciously, like he was trying to hide something." Hale could hear the strain in Garrett's voice, the way he was grasping at justifications. "Garrett, the witness statements and the body cam footage tell a different story. They show that Jerome Hayes was cooperative, that he tried to explain who he was, but you did not listen." Garrett shifted uncomfortably in his seat. "He was trying to throw me off. I was just following my training, Captain." "Your training?" Hale repeated, her tone sharp. "Garrett, your training does not excuse racial profiling. It does not excuse the fact that you escalated a situation that did not need to be escalated." Garrett opened his mouth to respond, but Hale held up a hand to stop him. "Look, Garrett, I am not here to argue with you. I am here to find out the truth. The evidence we have gathered so far is not in your favor. It shows that you made assumptions based on race, and that those assumptions led to an unjust arrest." There was a long silence as Garrett processed Hale's words. Finally he spoke, his voice low. "I did not mean for any of this to happen. I was just trying to do my job." Hale sighed. "I know, Garrett, but intent does not change the impact of your actions. This is not just about you. It is about what your actions represent and how they affect the people we are supposed to protect." Before Garrett could respond, there was another knock at the door. Harper stood and opened it. revealing Jerome Hayes, who stepped into the room with a calm, composed demeanor. "Mr. Hayes, thank you for coming in," Hale said, standing to shake Jerome's hand. Jerome nodded, his expression neutral. "Of course, Captain." Hale motioned for Jerome to take a seat, then turned back to Garrett. "Garrett, we are going to hear from Mr. Hayes now. I want you to listen carefully." Garrett nodded, though he could not meet Jerome's eyes. Hale gestured for Harper to begin. "Mr. Hayes, can you describe your encounter with Officer Knox from your perspective?" Jerome's voice was steady. "I was at the park enjoying my day off when Officer Knox approached me. He was aggressive from the start, demanding to see my ID and questioning me like I was already guilty of something. I tried to explain that I was an FBI agent, that there must have been some mistake, but he did not listen. He cuffed me, pushed me to the ground, and treated me like a criminal." Garrett flinched at Jerome's words, but he remained silent, his gaze fixed on the table in front of him. Harper continued, "Did you feel that Officer Knox's actions were influenced by your race?" Jerome did not hesitate. "Absolutely. I could see it in his eyes, the way he looked at me, the assumptions he made before I even had a chance to speak. I have dealt with this kind of thing before, but it is different when it comes from someone who is supposed to protect and serve." Hale could see the impact of Jerome's words on Garrett, the way his shoulders slumped slightly, the way he seemed to shrink into himself. But still, Garrett said nothing. "Thank you, Mr. Hayes," Hale said. "I appreciate your honesty." Jerome nodded, then stood to leave. As he reached the door, he paused and turned back to Garrett. "I do not hold any personal grudges, Officer Knox, but I hope you can take this as an opportunity to learn, to understand the impact of your actions. It is not just about what you intended. It is about how those intentions play out in the real world." With that, Jerome left the room, leaving a heavy silence. Hale looked at Garrett, who was still staring at the table. "Garrett, this investigation is not just about finding out what happened. It is about making sure it does not happen again. We have to do better for the people we serve and for ourselves." Garrett nodded slowly, but there was no fight left in him. The weight of the evidence, the words of Jerome Hayes, and the reality of his actions were all starting to sink in. But whether or not he was ready to fully confront that truth remained to be seen. "Take the rest of the day, Garrett," Hale said quietly. "We will reconvene tomorrow." Garrett stood, his movements stiff, and left the office without another word. As the door closed behind him, Hale felt a heavy sense of responsibility settle on her shoulders. This investigation was just the beginning. There was still much work to be done both within the department and beyond. But for now, all she could do was continue to piece together the truth and hope that it would lead to real change. Captain Vanessa Hale sat in her office. The final report of the investigation lay closed on her desk. The conclusion was clear and the decision had been made, but that did not make the task ahead any easier. She glanced at the clock, knowing Jerome Hayes would be arriving soon. The conversation they were about to have felt like a turning point, not just for Garrett Knox, but for the entire department. A soft knock at the door signaled Jerome's arrival. Hale stood and smoothed the front of her uniform, preparing herself for the conversation. "Come in," she called. The door opened and Jerome entered, his expression calm and composed as usual. He gave Hale a polite nod before taking a seat across from her. "Thank you for coming, Mr. Hayes," Hale began, sitting down as well. "Of course," Jerome replied, his tone steady. "I assume the investigation is complete." "It is," Hale confirmed, leaning forward slightly. "After reviewing all the evidence, the witness statements, the body cam footage, and the interviews, it has been decided that Officer Knox will be terminated from his position." Jerome nodded slowly, taking in the information. "I appreciate the thoroughness of the investigation, Captain, but I have to ask, do you believe this decision will lead to real change within the department?" Hale paused, choosing her words carefully. "I believe it is a step in the right direction. Garrett Knox's actions were unacceptable, and his termination sends a clear message that racial profiling and the abuse of power will not be tolerated. But I also know that firing one officer is not enough to address the deeper issues at play." Jerome's gaze remained steady as he replied, "You are right. This is about more than one officer. It is about the culture within the department, the training officers receive, and the biases that can influence their decisions in the field. If we do not address those underlying factors, incidents like this will keep happening." Hale nodded, appreciating Jerome's candor. "I agree. This incident has brought to light the need for systemic change, and I am committed to making that happen. We are already working on revising our training programs to include more comprehensive education on racial bias and de-escalation techniques. We are also planning to implement more rigorous oversight and accountability measures." "That is a good start," Jerome said, a hint of approval in his voice, "but it is going to take more than just policy changes. It is about changing the mindset of the officers, helping them understand the impact their actions have on the communities they serve. That is not something that can be achieved overnight." "I know," Hale admitted. "It is going to be a long and difficult process, but it is necessary if we want to rebuild trust and ensure that what happened to you does not happen to someone else." Jerome leaned back in his chair, his expression thoughtful. "I have been in law enforcement long enough to know that change does not come easy, especially when it involves confronting uncomfortable truths. But I'm willing to work with you, Captain, to help make those changes. This is not just about me. It is about creating a safer, more just system for everyone. Hale felt a surge of respect for Jerome. Despite everything he had been through, he was still willing to engage, to push for the reforms that were so desperately needed. "I appreciate that, Mr. Hayes," she said sincerely. "Your experience and insight will be invaluable as we move forward, and I want you to know that your voice will be heard." Jerome nodded. "Thank you, Captain. I am not looking for any special treatment. I just want to make sure that this department becomes the best version of itself. That is what the community deserves, and that is what the officers deserve too." Hale could not agree more. "You are right, and I promise you we are committed to making that happen." The room fell into a comfortable silence for a moment, both of them reflecting on the weight of the conversation. The decision to fire Garrett Knox was just the beginning. The real work lay ahead in the reforms and the cultural shift that would be necessary to prevent future injustices. As Jerome stood to leave, Hale rose as well, extending her hand. "Thank you again, Mr. Hayes. I look forward to working with you." Jerome shook her hand firmly. "Likewise, Captain. Let us make sure this is a turning point, not just a momentary reaction." With that, Jerome left the office, leaving Hale alone with her thoughts. She glanced at the closed investigation report on her desk one last time before turning her attention to the future. The decision had been made, but now it was up to her and the department to ensure that it led to real and lasting change. She knew the road ahead would be difficult, filled with resistance and challenges. But Hale was ready. This was about more than just one officer, more than just one incident. It was about doing what was right, no matter how hard that might be. With renewed determination, Hale reached for her phone and began making the calls that would set the reforms in motion. The department needed to evolve, and she would do everything in her power to make sure it did. The day was overcast as Jerome Hayes walked up the steps of the precinct. The air felt heavy, like the city itself was holding its breath, waiting to see what would happen next. Inside, the atmosphere was tense, but charged with a sense of anticipation. The changes Captain Hale had promised were starting to take shape, but there was still a long road ahead. As Jerome entered the building, he noticed the subtle shifts in the environment. A new bulletin board near the entrance displayed information about upcoming workshops on racial bias and de-escalation techniques. Officers moved through the halls with a different energy, their conversations quieter, more serious. The events of the past few weeks had left an indelible mark on everyone. Jerome made his way to Captain Hale's office, nodding politely to the officers he passed. Some returned the gesture with respect, while others avoided his gaze, still grappling with the fallout of what had happened. When he reached Hale's office, he found the door slightly ajar. He knocked softly before pushing it open. "Come in," Hale called, looking up from her desk. Jerome stepped inside, closing the door behind him. Hale rose from her chair and offered him a warm smile. "Good to see you again, Mr. Hayes." "Likewise, Captain," Jerome replied, taking a seat across from her. "I wanted to see how things were progressing." Hale nodded, her expression serious but determined. "We are making headway. The new training programs are being rolled out, and we are implementing stricter oversight to ensure accountability. It is a start, but there is still a lot of work to be done." Jerome appreciated her honesty. "Change takes time, but it is encouraging to see the steps you are taking. How is the department handling it?" "There has been some pushback," Hale admitted. "Not everyone is on board, but most of the officers understand that these changes are necessary. We have had a few difficult conversations, but I am hopeful that we are moving in the right direction." Jerome leaned forward slightly, his gaze intent. "That is good to hear. It is important to keep the momentum going to make sure these changes are more than just a response to one incident." "Agreed," Hale said. "This is about building a new foundation for how we operate, one that is rooted in fairness and respect for everyone we serve." As they spoke, the door to the office opened again and Garrett Knox stepped inside. His face was drawn, his eyes shadowed with exhaustion. He was dressed in plain clothes, a cardboard box in his hands. It was clear he was here to collect the last of his belongings. "Captain," Garrett greeted stiffly, avoiding eye contact with Jerome. "Garrett," Hale replied, her tone neutral. For a moment the room was silent, the air thick with unresolved tension. Garrett finally turned to Jerome, his expression tight. "Mr. Hayes, I just wanted to say I did not mean for things to turn out like this." Jerome met his gaze calmly. "It is not about what you meant, Officer Knox. It is about what you did and the impact it had. Intentions do not excuse actions." Garrett flinched at the bluntness of Jerome's words, but he nodded, accepting the truth. I do not know how to fix this." "You can start by acknowledging the problem," Jerome said evenly. "We all have biases, but it is how we deal with them that matters. You have the opportunity to learn from this, to become a better person because of it." Garrett's shoulders slumped slightly, the weight of the situation pressing down on him. He turned back to Hale, his voice barely above a whisper. "I suppose this is it then?" Hale nodded, her expression softening. "It does not have to be the end, Garrett. You can still choose to grow from this, to make changes in your life. But that is up to you." Garrett stood there for a moment, as if considering her words before giving a brief nod. "I will think about it." He paused, then added, "Good luck, Captain, and to you as well, Mr. Hayes." With that, Garrett turned and left the office, the door closing behind him with a soft click. Hale and Jerome watched him go, both lost in their thoughts. "Do you think he will be okay?" Jerome asked after a moment. Hale sighed, leaning back in her chair. "I hope so, but it is out of our hands now. All we can do is focus on the work in front of us." Jerome nodded in agreement, and there is plenty of that. They sat in silence for a few moments, the weight of their conversation hanging in the air. Finally, Jerome stood, extending his hand to Hale. "Thank you for everything, Captain. I appreciate your commitment to making things right." Hale shook his hand firmly. "Thank you, Mr. Hayes. Your involvement has been invaluable. We are in this together." With that, Jerome turned and left the office, making his way through the precinct one last time. As he walked down the halls, he could feel the eyes of the officers on him, some curious, some contemplative. He knew that change would not come easily, but he also knew that it was necessary. The events of the past few weeks had opened a door, and it was up to all of them to walk through it. As Jerome stepped out into the cool air, he took a deep breath, feeling a sense of resolve settle over him. The path ahead would be challenging, but he was ready to continue the fight for justice. This was just the beginning, and he was determined to see it through. With renewed determination, Jerome walked away from the precinct, his mind already turning to the next steps in his work. There was so much more to be done, but for the first time in a long while, he felt a glimmer of hope. Change was coming, and he would be there to help guide it every step of the way. This story teaches us a powerful truth about life. A person's dignity should never depend on whether others recognize their title, status, or success. Jerome Hayes was treated with suspicion, humiliation, and injustice, not because of anything he had done, but because of the prejudice in someone else's heart. And yet, what makes this story so deeply moving is not only the pain he endured, but the grace and strength with which he responded. He did not allow anger to control him. He did not let hatred define his worth. Instead, he stood firm in calm confidence, proving that true power is not in shouting the loudest, but in holding on to your character when the world tries to strip it away. In real life, many people carry invisible battles like this every day. They are judged too quickly, misunderstood too easily, and wounded by assumptions they never deserved. That is why this story matters so much. It reminds us that justice is not only about punishment, it is also about change, accountability, and the courage to make the world better for the next person. Sometimes the strongest people are not the ones who never suffer, but the ones who turn their suffering into wisdom, healing, and hope for others. If this story touched your heart, share your thoughts in the comments. Do you believe real strength is shown more through power or through self-control? Your voice may inspire someone who feels unseen today. And if you believe in meaningful stories about justice, courage, and human dignity, please like this video, subscribe to the channel, and turn on notifications so you never miss another powerful story.